and we see it when we study the science behind this. We see it in practice when we're taking case histories all the time. About 85 to 90% of our sensory kiddos that are struggling, mild, moderate to severe sensory issues, put them all together, 85 to 90% or more, we see birth intervention. We see one of these things in their case history. And now it's been proven in research and citations as well. Welcome to the Experience Miracles podcast, where we help parents find hope, answers, and drug-free help to overcome your child's chronic health challenges. I'm your host, Dr. Tony Ebel, and I'll be sharing my experiences as both a dad and a doctor on every episode. I can take the latest science and neurology of healing and break it down in the most simple and relatable way possible. We'll take on the toughest topics and answer your biggest questions through interviews with other amazing parents and leading experts, leaving you with practical action steps that you can take to help your child heal and thrive. It's time to expect and experience miracles. Let's get started. You were speaking our language like no one else has before. We actually felt heard and like someone else understood our daily challenges for the very first time. Moms, dads, providers, welcome to another episode of the Experience Miracles podcast here with me, your host, Dr. Tony Ebel. And those words right there are words spoken to me in a consultation, knee to knee, just really diving in deep with a dad, actually, well over 10 years ago. And this is early in my career. I had already shifted the practice towards pediatrics and prenatal care, but that was right in the beginning of the season where I went full speed, fully into the storm, if you will, for kiddos struggling with what we call the perfect storm, which is autism, sensory, ADHD, and anxiety. And one of those out of that list is our deep dive episode today, sensory processing disorder. And that's what this incredible dad was looking for help with. And his story is actually a great introduction to this podcast, because as he had been searching for help, he wasn't finding it. And yes, today, so the fact that this story goes back quite a while, it's a really good share right out of the gates that it is easier to find information, easier to find help for kiddos struggling with sensory processing disorder. But I really don't think we've done much to clean up the confusion for the millions of kids and families that are struggling with this. And that's actually a crazy conundrum out of the gates too. The real neurological essence, when we get into the science, which we do with all of our episodes, we break down the science. Anytime we do a deep dive into a disorder or a health challenge, you're going to hear the most cutting edge, advanced science that no one else teaches, and you're going to learn it from me in the most simple, relatable, and most importantly, actionable way. So you can take that information, do something with it, and get your kid better. And so when we get into the science, you'll see that if we sum it all up, sensory processing disorder and sensory challenges in kids is a confused nervous system. It's just a brain-body connection that is very dysregulated, very disorganized, and very disjointed. It's confused is the best real-life term I can give you. And that doubles down into this sensory storm that families live in and get stuck in every single day, because so many parents get confused as to, A, is this normal or not? Is my 2-year-old just having a tantrum? Because sometimes 2-year-olds do. Is my 3-year-old just having picky eating? Because sometimes kids are picky eaters. Are they struggling to fall asleep because they're just going through a growth spurt? And here's the deal. Like so many conditions, but my goodness, especially sensory processing disorder, you do not get your confusion cleaned up inside the traditional, conventional pediatrician's office. They are still very outdated as a general rule and very not up to speed with the neurology, the science, and the strategies of how to help families with sensory processing disorder. We could actually run this confusion analogy out even a little further in our introduction, because it's even confusing to know what to Google. We know now that sensory challenges in kids go by many names: sensory processing disorder, sensory integration disorder, sensory modulation disorder, sensory overdrive, sensory issues, sensory overwhelm. There's actually even more after that. I've actually written multiple articles that are kind of the same article, but I wrote them with different titles, because whatever it takes to get you the information that we're about to help your family, that's why we wrote the same article with different titles, or did the same short form talking head reel video, or the same long form, on YouTube. Whatever it takes to help your family through this sensory storm. I can't wait to do it with this episode, because it is one of the first conditions that I really studied to the nth degree. It's one of the first real life, absolutely real challenges that kids go through that I saw parents were just so disheartened by and so struggling with. Because here's the deal with sensory issues. Like this dad, they know they show up every single day. They also know there isn't a lot of help elsewhere in the healthcare world, again, especially the conventional healthcare world for kids with sensory issues. In fact, it gets worse. Most parents, when they bring up their children's sensory concerns at those maybe, 6-month or annual check-ins, they're usually just dismissed. That's normal. They're just a toddler. That's normal. Some kids just are a little picky. That's normal. Some kids just struggle with transitions. They'll grow out of it. No, they won't. Kids with colic grow into sensory issues. Kids with sensory issues grow into ADHD, anxiety, and often, if they're bad enough, autism spectrum disorder. And I need to say that right out of the gates, and I'll show you the science. We have the articles written. When you're done listening to this podcast, you can go to our website, www.pxdocs.com, docs.com. You can read all the articles, educational research cited articles about this, and all those research citations to connect these dots to other conditions, to connect these dots to what we're going to call the perfect storm 3 triggers, going back to pregnancy, going back to labor and delivery, and early childhood, even infant development, and how this neurology, when thrown off track, grows into sensory issues in kids. We've got the research, and the research, you can have it. It's in the articles. It's there. You don't really need the research as a parent. You need the explanation and the understanding as to why it's happening, what's really causing it. Because the moment you get the why and what's causing it, the action steps, the strategies, the drug-free, just these things help your child calm and ease their storm. That's what you're looking for. That's what I'm going to give you. And that's what that dad was looking for. Now, this one's going to date me a little bit as I put the final bow on this story. I've always, real early in my career, all the way back in 2008, I first put together the perfect storm concept, which is the science and the sequence of what's causing kids to get so sick. Now, my perfect storm studies began wanting to know what causes autism. The moment you open the hood on autism, which we're going to do in the thick of this episode, you know that sensory issues run rampant in kids with autism. They are all tied together neurophysiologically. And so I really early, 15 plus years ago, I became an expert in sensory processing disorder and sensory development and sensory challenges in kiddos way back when maybe a few OTs were working on this and knew about it. But really back then, to this dad and to me, when we were looking for, I'm looking at it from a doctor's side of things, and he's looking at it from a help my kid side of things. If you'd asked 100 people, even healthcare professionals, hey, can you tell me about sensory processing disorder? I don't know that 15 years ago, more than 1 or 2, and they definitely would have needed to be a pediatric OT, a pediatric PT maybe, or a pediatric chiropractor to be able to really understand this stuff. You would get an 0 for 100 answer in a conventional pediatrician. And even though this is a neurodevelopmental, neurosensory, neuro dysfunction and dysregulation disorder, still today, you're not going to get a good explanation and understanding from a traditional medical neurologist. Now, what this dad struggled with and the way we found them. So once I put together these answers and these explanations we're going through, I couldn't keep it to myself. So back in the early stages of my practice, am I really going to admit this on the podcast? I am. Here we go. I'll just keep talking. We did not have the Book of Face. Facebook. We definitely didn't have Instagram. We definitely weren't dancing and ruining our lives on TikTok. Just kidding. There's a lot of good to everything, including social media. We use it to find you and serve and transform your family's health. So I'm pro social media for good people, good things happening on it. And like the rest of the world, doesn't mean everyone uses it for good. I digress. I was running radio ads. See, I'm old. I just, I kind of went off track there because I didn't want to admit that on the podcast. But we ran radio ads around here in McHenry County, Illinois, Star 105. What's up, Joe Cicero, my homie, who was the DJ at the time and would help us do some of these ad reads. And I did an ad read. I did a 30 to 60 second quick explanation. You're not going to believe that I explained sensory processing disorder in 60 seconds because we're, 8 minutes into this episode and we're still rocking the introduction and storytelling here to set the tone for why altered tone within your child's neuromotor system causes sensory processing disorder and how we can find that and fix that with what we do. But this dad was commuting to his job in the city. And when I said the words on that radio ad, sensory processing disorder, and I also wrote a few articles for local magazines, I thought I would just date myself even more by saying magazines. I was getting the word out to families that so needed me too. I'll just flash forward to that kiddo. That dad was almost in tears because they just had not been able to find help anywhere. So he said he literally pulled over to the side of the road and called our office the moment I said and explained to him what was actually going on with sensory processing disorder. And so wherever you are on your sensory journey, if you are just now figuring out, I think my kid has some sensory issues, and you're opening the hood to learn more, or you've been battling sensory issues every single day, meltdowns, tantrums, difficult transitions, kids won't try new foods. You're trying to get your child's gut to heal through healthy eating, macronutrients, protein, good, fruits and vegetables, and big old horse pill supplements that sometimes those supplements come in. And you're like, I know how I get my kid's gut-brain connection to heal. I'll get them to eat healthy. And your sensory kid is like, no, you won't. I will have Kraft mac and cheese and a Rockstar energy drink for breakfast, please. Because when you have sensory issues, when your kiddos, therefore your family, have sensory issues, they show up every single day. They are not come and go. There are things that trigger them and make them worse, but they are literally daily quality of life disturbances. And we can't wait to get into the weeds of this conversation with you and help those everyday challenges cease to exist and be replaced with what kids deserve, which is an absolute full potential, calm, regulated, fully functioning, rockin', no disturbances, nervous system. I know that's a nerdy nervous system chiropractor way to say some things, but on the other side of a fully regulated, fully balanced, fully just perfectly functioning nervous system is a child's fullest expression of life. So I want to have this sensory conversation with you, not just to get rid of their challenges. It's not about that for us. We don't treat, we don't cure sensory issues. We don't treat, we don't cure ear infections, fill in the blank on any condition. What we do is we address the root cause, the neurophysiological dysfunctions that cause these issues. We get those out of the way. Your child is designed by God to get better and heal on their own. So when they have the perfect brain-body communication and their sensory processing is not dysregulated, but fully regulated and rocking, they get through these challenges on their own. Your child and you getting this information and getting them connected to the doctors and the care they need, that'll be the hero in the story. I'm just a vehicle for neurology and action steps, okay? So I can't wait to hear your child's healing, but you just need to know this. Sensory challenges and sensory issues in kids are not normal. Don't let anybody normalize this stuff for you. When your child's nervous system gets imbalanced from the things we're about to talk about and to the degree that we're about to talk about, that is a dysregulated and just disconnected, disorganized nervous system. And that's not normal. That is not what your child should experience every single day. It's not normal. They're not going to grow out of them. And it's not something you just need to learn to live with. It's not something you just need to put workarounds and adaptations to. It's not, we have to avoid this for our child and avoid that for our child and avoid this for our child if we want to have a decently good day. That's not fair to them. That's not fair to you. Sensory issues are not just for kids. Sensory issues are very much a challenge for teenagers and adults as well. And it is very rare that sensory issues exist on their own. Now, it's a challenge, the word condition just sometimes for parents and patients, because the medical world has said, if you have a diagnosis, you have it forever. There's no healing. You can't do anything about it. And they just kind of write people off once the diagnosis. I don't even like talking about diagnoses, but I know I need that too. Like that dad said, he's like, it's like my antenna was up for anybody talking about sensory challenges for kids. And so the moment I heard, and I thought that was kind of a funny analogy that he used antenna to, because it was radio ads, but we're here to talk about getting to the other side of them. But we know that we need to get awareness by having the conversation with you in the terminology that you recognize. So sensory issues can, to a degree, for some kiddos in kind of a mild to moderate arena, they can exist on their own. But the vast majority of the time, when we're talking about sensory issues in kids, we're also talking about autism spectrum disorder. We are also talking about ADHD, anxiety, and challenges such as that. They are also very much clinically correlated. And this is one of those chicken and egg conversations with gross and fine motor challenges and speech delays. So when I say chicken or the egg, it's like, okay, are my child's gross motor delays, fine motor challenges, are they causing my kiddos sensory issues and speech challenges? Yes, in sequence, that makes sense. But we wouldn't be done getting you the answers and the action steps you need to help the end output, sensory and speech issues for that kiddo who has gross and fine motor challenges until we answer, well, why are they having gross motor challenges? Why'd they have fine motor challenges? What's going on with their neuromotor, neurodevelopmental, neurosensory system causing that? Okay, so let's go into it. Number one, just breaking down and giving you a better understanding of sensory integration, modulation, disorganization, overdrive, and that disorder, okay, that goes by many names. First and foremost, this is a nervous system conversation if there ever was one. The nervous system, central autonomic nervous system, you'll hear me use those two words to talk about the nervous system. So autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system where everything runs on autopilot, which is the majority of it. And then the central nervous system gets into some of the motor units and those sorts of functions. But for now, let's just talk nervous system. The nervous system is responsible for receiving and processing, so organizing, integrating sensory information. This process is formally known as sensory integration. Therefore, sensory integration and modulation disorders are a type of challenge where the brain is really struggling to figure out what the body is doing. It's really struggling to process appropriately the senses and the sensations coming from A, inside the body, so we're going to call that the internal environment, and B, outside the body, so the external environment. Now, there's a really incredible leading researcher in this world, Jane Ayers, who always talked about with sensory challenges in kids, it's like there's a neurological traffic jam. And that is a really great way to look at this because the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, just the nervous system as a whole, operates as air traffic control for the entire body. And it is, I practice outside of Chicago, O'Hare International. Many of you cringe right now because if you have to fly through there, you don't like it. It's actually awesome if it's your home airport because we live in the middle of the United States. We've got direct flights all over the place because it's one of the busiest airports in the world. I can't say it's one of the best planned airports in the world. So there's definitely some sensory processing challenges that I would imagine the air traffic controllers and organizers, the brain, if you will, of O'Hare deal with. And so this neurological traffic jam that is sensory processing disorder, it really starts to strongly correlate with words we're going to introduce next, called subluxation, dysautonomia, vagus nerve dysfunction, and nervous system dysregulation. Now, there will not be an exam after this, but if you saw those four terms, let's say I did. Let's say I'm as nerdy as can be. I actually miss being in school. I tell my kids all the time, and they just roll their eyes at me. I love studying with them because I'm like, oh, what if I can come? I'm not going to take the test for my kiddos. That would not help them get to a better place. But I miss school and test taking. So let's say I was to blast out a survey to all of our podcast listeners, and I said, all right, when we're talking about sensory processing and sensory processing disorder and sensory challenges in kids, which of these four terms would a parent really benefit from learning a ton more about? Well, subluxation, dysautonomia, nervous system dysregulation, and vagus nerve dysfunction. If those showed up, A, B, C, D, I would have you circle E, all of the above, because there's a brain-body connection in play for our kiddos, for all of us, and that is literally the sensory processing system. So the way that sensory processing works is there's actually 7 senses. If you think back to your high school health classes, they probably maybe just told you about the 5, taste, touch, smell, and so forth, but there's actually a 6th and a 7th that is very essential and most important by far. The other 5, the basic 5, we'll call them the kind of old school 5, very involved in sensory processing disorder, but the 6th and 7th are what are called proprioception or vestibular function. So the perception of balance and movement. So where the body, where the muscles, which is really, we got to dive deeper into the nerves, where the neuromuscular system is in place. And so when there's this neurological traffic jam and this brain-body disconnection, it absolutely affects how a child can regulate their behavior and their emotions it can absolutely affect their motor functions, and it can really get in the way of their day-to-day activities. And so there is so many things that sensory issues show up with because we're talking about brain to body disconnection and dysregulation. It can show up as body-based problems. We'll simplify it that way. So it can show up as gross motor, fine motor, coordination, running, tactile, so body-based sensation challenges. And it can also, always does, show up as brain-based challenges as well, where their behavior and their sleep and their emotion is affected as well. So we're talking about brain and body being separate in this way, but they are really one system. The central and autonomic nervous system is one interconnected system, and it has to regulate millions, trillions of functions and cells happening every single second inside the body. And then the other thing the sensory processing system has to do is just take everything that's happening on the outside and have the brain make sense of it. So that is a difficult proposition for any system. So once we subluxate it, which you'll hear in a little bit, is interference. So traffic jam, just like Dr. Ayers talked about. Subluxation is that neurological traffic jam. And once subluxation and then these other things that spin off from it get in the way, well, now the nervous system, the sensory processing system's ability to appropriately process, integrate, and regulate all, and that's a big letter, there's a lot under that word, all of those functions, is greatly limited and restricted. And so this air traffic control neurological traffic jam is a really good way to understand what's going on with your child's brain-body connection and their sensory processing system. Now, where sensory challenges in kids can get even a little bit trickier to understand is they are different in every kiddo. We'll categorize and group them together into kind of like two main groups with some subgroups underneath them here in a sec. But that's what's tricky. Sensory issues in kids can show up in a multitude of ways. Simplifying it and kind of bifurcating it for a second, there is overstimulation components of sensory processing disorder, and then there is understimulation. So for the overstimulated kiddos, they are very sensitive to common noises, lightest touches, flashing lights. So these are the kiddos because even at rest, so we have nicknamed these kiddos raging bull sensory kiddos. So even at rest, once their nervous system is subluxated, subluxation shifts the nervous system into what's called sympathetic fight or flight overdrive. So sensory overdrive and sympathetic overdrive, one and the same. I want you to think of those terms as the same forever forward. A sensory kiddo is stuck, for the most part, in this sympathetic fight or flight gas pedal side of the nervous system. It's overstimulated even at rest. Now, double tap on that with me. Even at rest. So when they're not having a tantrum, when they're not having a meltdown, when they're not struggling on the outside, that doesn't mean everything is calm and quiet on the inside. What we know about sensory processing disorder and these overstimulation raging bull cases in kids is even at rest, their brain is noisy. There's a term we'll continue to introduce as we go along called nociception. Nociception is the opposite of the good guy we introduced a few minutes ago called proprioception, the perception of movement. So what happens to an overstimulated sensory kiddo is the moment that these sounds and these noises and these transitions come into their brain, which is already noisy, already overstimulated, they got to move. They got to get out of there. They've got to overreact to an overstimulated system. On the other hand, some kiddos are hypostimulated. They are really undersensitive, if you will. And so for those kiddos, we've often kind of said, well, that physically, because we're going to really dive into the motor system, it's very, very connected to sensory challenges. In fact, sensory processing disorder lives in the neuromotor connection between the brain and the body. And those kiddos who are understimulated are commonly nicknamed as drunken bulls. So they are just physically uncoordinated. They struggle to maintain their posture. They struggle to have the gross motor functions like running and skipping and jumping. So the gross motor, just kind of disjointed kind of sensory processing disorder, those are the kiddos who are not going to partake in sports. Those are the kiddos who are not going to love gym class. Those are the kiddos who are going to have a hard time focusing and connecting. So if you can see where we're going with these neurological, these two different categories of sensory processing disorder, Now, and I'm kind of jumping a few on my notes here, but we can actually talk about the connections to other conditions. A raging bull, sympathetic dominant, overstimulated all the time kiddo is going to go down the ADHD road, where the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, the overstimulation, that's going to look like that. I actually think ADHD is massively misdiagnosed in millions of kiddos, because if we really, and again, if for my work, our work, it's not about putting a diagnosis on it, period. But if we were really to say, oh, that kid with ADHD, what's going on? What do they really have? And we had to call it a disorder, because it's not. It's an imbalance and dysfunction within the nervous system. It's not how they're designed. They're not broken. There's nothing wrong with them. Their nervous system is just not as balanced, as regulated as it's about to be when we get through this episode and we get you the connections and the natural drug-free action steps you need to help your kiddo with sensory, with ADHD, with autism, whatever it is. But these kiddos, if you had to say, I've always told it this way, if somebody had to say, okay, all these cases you see, autism, ADHD, anxiety, if you had to, if they forced me to put a label, you can see I hate doing this. If they forced me to put a label and a diagnosis on a kiddo, thankfully I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't have to play the diagnosis and treatment game. I can actually get to the root cause and get the child to heal and get through it on their own. But if I had to, and see how much I don't want to, I'm taking a long way to get to this, I would say they have sensory processing challenges. I can't even say the word disorder. Not even on this, not even in my kind of made up parody here. So sensory challenges that are overstimulated and excessive for a kiddo can go into raging bull, and that's your ADHD, hyperactivity, impulsivity, overstimulated. The other side is true too. The sensory kiddo whose nervous system has become discombobulated, that is the official Iowa term for nervous system dysregulation, those kiddos are more of your classic ADD, where they struggle not just physically with their motor coordination and posture and body movements, but the brain and body are connected. That is the whole essence of this conversation. And the main take home is that this is a brain-body disconnection, dysregulation, and dysfunction that can be found and fixed. And so those drunken bull kiddos tend to show up more as emotional dysregulation, focus and concentration challenges. And then you better believe it, you can see it in their gross motor and fine motor difficulties moving through life in that way as well. All right, so looking at it from that hypersensitive, overstimulated, raging bull sort of nickname concept, and then the understimulated, disorganized, drunken bull component, those kind of take this conversation of the two different main types of sensory challenges in kids, and it takes it from a 30,000 foot view, which was our, air traffic control, jammed up brain-body disconnection, gets it a little more broken down into these two different types. We'll call that kind of like 10,000 foot view. Now let's go granular. When kids are overstimulated, the day-to-day challenges can look like clothes being too itchy, sounds being too loud, lights being too bright, just screaming, talking anytime somebody is, it's a loud place with a lot of people talking. That's going to be a big challenge. They don't really love to be touched, right? Especially in extra sensitive areas. A lot of times that is the head, the neck. That's why haircuts and brushing teeth and going to the dentist. Gagging is there, trying new foods is there. So again, the jaw, because the upper neck, we're about to go to that next, is really loaded with these proprioceptors in the vagus nerve, the main areas that get really thrown off base with sensory challenges. Any of those specific areas of the body are going to be the most extra sensitive to touch. A lot of times, because this is another sign of something we're about to really dive into, a dysautonomia and the nervous system and the vagus nerve dysfunction being off track, a kiddo can actually even vomit sometimes when the response is so much. And so they just have these misappropriate sort of perceptions within. Again, it's not them. It's not their conscious decision making. It's not how they want to be experiencing life. In fact, it's the antithesis of that. But their brain is just so sensory dysregulated, so subluxated and off track. It'll take soft touch and it'll make it feel hard and too much. It'll be that they just react extremely to sudden movements. They really have these challenges. Their writing skills. So a raging bull kiddo, a hypersensitive sensory kind of ADHD kiddo, they might actually thrive in fast twitch, fast action sports. They might actually go through their motor milestones too fast. A lot of times parents are like, we didn't have motor milestones. They aren't clumsy. In fact, they're the opposite. Like baseball, sprinting, football. Raging bulls tend to love high energy, high, fast gas pedal sports. And so they may be great there, but then when it gets into school, that I love every sport and play them 24/7, can't stop moving kiddo may struggle in school with handwriting, reading comprehension, because the brain is going so fast because of these sensory challenges and subluxation and sympathetic dominance. It can't slow down to do some of the more fine motor detailed tasks. And then the kids who are understimulated will often go after sensory seeking behaviors. And so they'll just be a little antsy and a little restless and a little discombobulated. They really struggle to pick up on social cues, personal space, kind of that emotional EQ or emotional intelligence. They will go after some sensory seeking behaviors to fill that void. So jumping from heights, jamming into things, bumping into things. They just don't really respond well to different changes in temperature or different weather changes. They're constantly wanting visual stimulation to stimulate that understimulated system. So these drunken bull ADD kiddos will really get hooked on different video games and those things. Often sensory kids of all kinds will chew on things to try and create stimulus and get there. And they have a high pain threshold. And then honestly, you go through these two lists, and for a second there, we categorize, oh, hey, here's hypersensitive raging bull kiddos, and here's the undersensitive, or kind of the understimulated hyposensitivity kiddos. And you're like, wait a minute, my child experiences some of both lists. Yes, almost every kiddo with sensory processing challenges has some of the overstimulation and some of the understimulation. And that is actually a great segue into the science as to what's really causing sensory processing disorder and sensory issues in kids. Now, we've already actually said them multiple times, but what happens is the first trigger of this stress in kids can go all the way back to preconception and pregnancy. What we now know, and again, if you want this research, I'm about to reference a bunch of different research citations, and just honestly, these are clinical observations and experiences I sorted out in practice first, and then went into PubMed and so forth and found the research and put it all together from that perfect storm concept we mentioned before and talk about all the time here on the Experience Miracles podcast. But the first thing we see in a child's case history all the time, and something that is very strongly shown in the research, is that if there is a high stress, high risk pregnancy, there's a higher correlation clinically, neurologically, of sensory and neurosensory and neurodevelopmental challenges later on in life. So that can be trigger number one. We're going to take the perfect storm and we're going to simplify this into three parts in order, in sequence chronologically. So the first trigger is fertility and pregnancy challenges. We're going to put those together and call those one. The reason for that is that child's nervous system, the first thing to develop in utero is actually the nervous system. And it goes in a certain sequence. The sympathetic fight or flight side of the nervous system actually develops first, because the first stages of in utero, or what's called fetal development, are actually supposed to be more in protective mode, more in sympathetic mode. The parasympathetic system, the vagus nerve, doesn't really fully develop until that pregnancy is reaching full term. And so kiddos who are born with pregnancies that have more stress, more anxiety, more medical risk and intervention tend to end and therefore baby be born a little bit early or a lot of bit early. So there's a high correlation between pregnancy stress, premature birth, and then that segues right into that second thing, birth, labor, and intervention. There is a high clinical correlation we can explain and are about to explain the neuromotor injuries that happen from birth trauma, forceps, vacuum, C-section, scheduled or emergency, induction, cord wrapped, breech position, manual assistance, episiotomy, epidural. These all things kind of lumped together become the second component of the perfect storm triggers, the second thing in chronological order. And that physical manual birth trauma from things like forceps and vacuum and C-section, they very much physically alter and injure the nerves, the muscles, the tissues of the upper neck, the brainstem, and really the whole neurospinal system, which is where air traffic control, autonomic and central nervous system regulation, and the vagus nerve reside anatomically. So the second major trigger of sensory challenges later on in life for kiddos, and we see it when we study the science behind this. We see it in practice when we're taking case histories all the time. About 85 to 90% of our sensory kiddos that are struggling, mild, moderate to severe sensory issues, put them all together, 85 to 90% or more, we see birth intervention. We see one of these things in their case history. And now it's been proven in research and citations as well. And again, you can go to pxdocs.com, find the articles that talk about sensory issues, sensory integration, sensory processing, and you will see the studies I'm referencing as a kind of broad scope. You will see them linked in detail on the bottom of all those articles. And then the third component that triggers sensory is alterations in those early developmental stages, that first year of life, second year of life, and third year of life. And so if an infant is colicky and stressed out all the time and the pediatrician says, don't worry, they'll grow out of it, well, that really sensitive, really wound up, doesn't sleep well, doesn't soothe well infant kind of sounds like a 4-year-old with sensory challenges, right? Tantrums and difficulty listening, following direction, making transitions, dealing with loud noises, dealing with, just disturbances to their environment, and then they overreact. So a crying infant is a meltdown, tantrum, sensory kiddo, misbehaving, if you will, by the categories of diagnostic criteria, ADHD kiddo later on. The neurology is one and the same. So the third element is alterations in those first couple of years. That could be chemical reactions, that could be food intolerances, food allergies, adverse reactions to medical interventions. All overuse of antibiotics is a major player if a kiddo is diagnosed with, if they're put on antibiotics in those early stages, especially the first 2 years of life, it very much disrupts the gut-brain connection, the vagus nerve, the microbiome, where serotonin and dopamine and these very important neuro-regulating components are absorbed and brought into the system. So I could and have done an entire episode, and we'll do many of them, on the perfect storm. And so if you want to take this chunk of this episode about what's really causing sensory processing challenges in kids and go all the way down that perfect storm road, go into that episode. Actually, episode number 1 discusses exactly that. What is the perfect storm? But those 3 things then do these 4 things. Now, really, these 4 things are kind of one thing. I'm about to tell you 4 different things that we mentioned before. When I talked about the answer would be E, all the above. Each of them is actually more similar than different, but I want to discuss them each and connect them to sensory processing disorder. Because once you understand these 4 things, and then you get connected to how to take care of these 4 things, that's the whole goal of this whole episode. So that first neurological term that is strongly clinically correlated to sensory challenges in kids is called subluxation. We've said it probably 30 times already on this episode, but subluxation occurs when the nervous system has become overstressed. Subluxation sets in when the stress overwhelms a child's nervous system's ability to adapt, be resilient, and overcome. So here's when that is most likely to set up shop. Early in life, when they're still building. A child in utero and in those first 3 years of life, their nervous system, their digestive system, their immune system, their motor system, children are born obviously very immature, very not yet developed. And so when stress from the perfect storm and those 3 triggers we talked about, when it shows up early and often and a lot, the nervous system is much more sensitive. It's much more plastic, what we call neuroplasticity at that point. So it shifts the nervous system into sympathetic dominance. So too much stress early on creates subluxation. Once subluxation is there, the nervous system gets out of balance and it shifts into sympathetic dominance as its first response. And you better believe that it's absolutely going to jam up that air traffic controller. You better believe that is absolutely going to create that nervous system traffic jam, and sensory processing and brain to body and nervous system to internal and external environment communication are going to be thrown haywire. Once that haywire continues, subluxation then grows into, if you will, or becomes dysautonomia and nervous system dysregulation. So thing number 2 and thing number 3 here on my list of 4. Dysautonomia is a catch-all term for what we're talking about here. The nervous system gets out of balance. Now, the reason that dysautonomia needs a little bit more of a deep dive is it's not just sympathetic dominance. When the nervous system is in this state of dysautonomia and dysregulation, you have too much sympathetic dominance, fight or flight, hypertonicity in one part of the system, and you have too little tone, too little sensory stimuli in other parts of the body, brain, and nervous system. So if we go back just a bit and we talk about, hey, my kid's got some of both list, that's because when dysautonomia is present in your child's nervous system, some things will be excessively stimulated and stuck in sympathetic dominance. And the moment you have too much tone, too much tension somewhere in the motor system, you're then going to have too little tone elsewhere. So if you've taken your child to a PT or to an OT, they may talk about these things. They may talk about certain areas, hands, jaw, airway, tongue ties, these things that are too tight, too wound up. And then they'll very likely talk about hypotonia within the core or within other things with the tongue and different functions if you're going deep down that road. Well, you cannot have muscle weakness if you don't have muscle tension somewhere else. You can't have muscle tension, so muscle motor, same word here. You can't have motor tone, tension, excessive tone and tension, or motor low tone and weakness if you don't first have neurological imbalance and interference. Subluxation is the interference. Dysautonomia is the neurological imbalance. So the gross motor system and all other systems follow suit. So this is really where motor, neuromotor, tone, and coordination enters the sensory processing conversation. It is the access point through which these troubles from birth trauma and such set up shop, which means, here's the good news, here's where we're going, which means that's the system we've got to access through movement-based care. So OT is absolutely phenomenal. OT absolutely helps sensory kids in a major way. OT, PT, and speech are movement-based therapies. They're looking to create movement within the child. So it's play and it's interaction and it's these different things to stimulate different areas of the system, of the sensory processing system, to try and get some areas back online and get other areas to calm down. Primarily in the movement-based world, OT, PT, the best moves they have are to try and extra stimulate the ones that are understimulated to get balance. So PT is the easiest one you can always think of. They're working on low tone, right? Working on a weak core. What we run into with families all the time is they can have been doing months, sometimes years of movement-based therapies, PT, OT, and speech, and they've seen some results and seen some cool things, or maybe some families haven't seen much results, and lots of families over time plateau. They get some changes, but not full changes. And that right there should reveal to us what we've been talking about this whole time in the meat of this episode. There's a deeper neurological dysfunction before the alterations in motor tone and dysfunction. So the way you really improve the motor tone and coordination, proprioception, vestibular function, auditory processing, you name it, all motor tone, including the gut as well, because that's just a bunch of muscles on the inside. In order to get those working better, you've got to get the central and autonomic nervous system working better first. And the most important part of that is the vagus nerve. So in this list of 4 different neurological challenges that are very similar, if not almost the same thing, that we need to find, and again, in my Iowa terminology, we need to fix these things. These aren't the disorder. These aren't the challenge. These are the cause. These are the triggers and the underlying dysfunctions that add up to the symptoms, which get in the medical world, not our world, diagnosed as sensory processing disorder and so forth. But it's vagus nerve dysfunction. The other thing for sensory families to really get a good handle on is the vagus nerve. When that upper cervical area is injured from birth, breech position, and these things, toxic influences, when the sympathetic nervous system is overstimulated, the vagus nerve becomes suppressed from the perfect storm. The vagus nerve gets shut down. So vagus nerve suppression and dysfunction is essential to know about and go get something to help it, aka neurologically focused chiropractic adjustments, which I'll spend our last couple of minutes breaking down for you. Because out of all the sensory nerves in the body, the vagus nerve is the most important one, and it's not even close. It is nicknamed the great wandering nerve or the great protector. The vagus nerve is 85% sensory. Some research kind of has it up or down on that number a little bit. And it's 85% it's entirely parasympathetic. meaning calming, resting, processing, integrating, modulating, regulating. The vagus nerve is the most important nerve to help kids with sensory challenges. It's something you need to know about inside and out. And vagus nerve dysfunction or vagus nerve suppression needs vagus nerve stimulation and vagus nerve activation to get the parasympathetics and the regulation and the processing system, the brain-body connection back online, literally to the T, anatomically. The vagus nerve is the brain-body connection. Many other nerves connect the brain to the body, but if we rank them all out and we say which one's most important, it is the vagus nerve, especially to this conversation. I know I am being intentionally redundant right here, saying the same thing 50 times over, because once you learn about subluxation, dysautonomia, nervous system dysregulation, and vagus nerve dysfunction, and you learn this final 2 minutes of this podcast episode, the only thing that can really that deeply, that directly, I like to say that potently repair and restore function and restore regulation to the central nervous system, specifically the vagus nerve, the autonomic nervous system, and your child's sensory processing system is neurologically focused chiropractic adjustments. So how do we help? How do you get drug-free help? How do you help your kiddo with sensory challenges of all kinds without drugs? And how do you help if you've maybe already done the other movement-based therapies and you've put the sensory gym in your basement and you've changed the clothes and changed the diet and tried all the other things, and yet your child's sensory issues still persist? What is missing? Neurologically focused pediatric chiropractic care is what's missing. Number one, here's how we help. We find out if we can help. We do a deep dive into your child's case history. And if we see these perfect storm triggers, it's almost an absolute shoo-in. My goodness, do they need to get adjusted, and will respond wonderfully when they do. But that's not just enough. We're not just taking case history and going through the triggers and the perfect storm sequence and then taking symptomatic. That's valuable. The surveys, the questionnaires, the case history, it's essential. But what is most essential to our intake process for sensory kids as nervous system focused PX doctors is we use a technology called the insight scanning system that measures dysautonomia, measures what's called dyskinesis and dystonia. So literally measures the alterations. We can find where in the system is there too much tone and too much noise, and where in the system is it exhausted and understimulated. These scans, particularly the EMG, which is neuromuscular tone or neuromotor tone, we run them through this neurospinal system, which is responsible for 60 to 80% of all proprioception into the brain. And the upper cervical spine is responsible for a third of it, a lot of research shows. That vestibular proprioception function is primarily coming from the core of the system, if you will, which is the neck, the thoracics, and the neurospinal system as a whole. And then HRV, heart rate variability technology. We can measure, is your child's nervous system out of balance? Is it sympathetic dominant? Is it exhausted? We can literally find out if nervous system focused chiropractic can help. So you don't have to guess, we test. We literally can measure. I know, man, talk about overusing the word literally. You're probably like, oh my goodness, hopefully this isn't a beer drinking game here. I'll just sneak in a joke that you have to, take that every time, take a drink every time I say literally, because I know that is a word. I listen to my kids talk and I'm like, you say literally a lot. I must say literally a lot. So literally, this technology can change your family's life because it can find the actual root cause dysfunction, subluxation, nervous system dysregulation, dysautonomia, and especially with HRV, we can find out if the vagus nerve is online or if your child's struggling with sensory issues. It's very likely that it's offline. Once we have these scans, then the next step is we put together a fully personalized, customized, not symptom dependent, not what every other kiddo gets. We put together a personalized, customized, perfectly curated for your child's nervous system care plan. We call it our neurological repair and restoration plan. There is very likely a lot of repair and a lot of restoration that needs to happen to the nervous system and the brain-body connection of your sensory kiddo. And once we get that tension released and we get the nervous system moving in the right direction, then we continue with care over the course of a couple of weeks to most often many months to get what we call neurological reorganization. We work with the same science that causes the storm to get a child out of the storm. If their challenges are stemming from abnormal dysfunctional movement patterns, neuromotor patterns, too much in some areas and too little in other areas, then you need to see a specific specialized chiropractor who not only knows this and not only can measure this, But the final thing to teach you on this podcast episode is this is a special kind of chiropractic where we know with certain what are called neurotonal adjustments, we know where your child's hypertonicity, where that sensory tension and noise is too loud and too much and too stuck. And we make these crazy light, crazy gentle, crazy easy adjustments to release that stuck sympathetic tension. The first response that happens, that's usually the first part of the care plan and adjusting protocol. The first thing that happens is your child sleeps easier. They calm easier. They digest better. There's tons of changes we can see when we do these sympathetic fight or flight tension release adjustments. But for sensory kids, as we've talked about this whole time, nearly every single one of them also has understimulated, shut down, suppressed, disorganized components of neurological dysfunction and subluxation. So additionally, our PX doctors and real special trained nervous system chiropractors that see kids with sensory challenges know how to make other adjustments that are going to stimulate and activate the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic system. It is the combination of these different techniques that gets the most fantastic drug-free neurological healing and restoration for sensory kiddos. So to put a bow on this, if your child struggles with sensory issues, number one, find out more, learn more. Go to our website, go to our YouTube, and learn everything you can about subluxation, dysautonomia, nervous system dysregulation, and vagus nerve dysfunction. Go on the hunt. Moms, dads, you deserve this information, and we've got it there for you on the website. From there, you'll see each article clicks to explain another article about our clinical protocol, about everything I just walked through for a few minutes, and about the insight scans and the sensory processing tests that we can do through these scans. And you can click on those and you can see visuals. You can see videos that show this stuff before you even go into an office. And the moment you're ready to go into that office and find out, is this the missing link? Is this the thing I've been looking for to get my child out of these daily struggles and out of this storm? You can find connection to our PX Doc directory there on the website as well. We know exactly how to get to the root cause of these challenges. We know exactly how to rebuild, reorganize, and take care of a child's nervous system over the course of many weeks to many months. And that's what it is. I know the final question is, hey, now that I know a little bit about the fact that A, this is what's missing, and B, how it works, when should I start to see changes? Well, the first changes you'll see when your kiddo's getting neurologically focused adjustments is the foundational essential changes with sleep, their posture, their movement patterns, their digestion. They'll get over colds and flus. Sensory kids get sick way more easy all the time because of all these things we've been talking about. So you'll see these initial changes. We call them neurological soft signs. Second, you'll see the scans change. So we run those scans not only as a baseline, but the awesome thing with this approach to chiropractic, and again, do not take your kiddo to an office, to a doctor that doesn't use this technology. If your child has neurosensory challenges, there has to be real neurological testing to get started and to track changes. We need to see objective clinical data. So I know that's a nerd way of saying it, but we need to see proof that the nervous system is actually healing, reorganizing, and repairing. That not only sets us apart from medicine, but that sets this approach apart from other chiropractors, where we're not just chasing symptoms and we're not just tracking, those changes through surveys and questionnaires. Crazy important. We're looking to change life, but we're looking to change your child's quality of life for good. So we need to see through these progress scans that the nervous system is actually healing, reorganizing, and rebalancing so that we know the changes that they're going to experience with symptoms in life and quality of life will stick. And that's my favorite thing about chiropractic. We're actually getting to the root cause. We're actually improving how the brain and the body work so that these changes aren't just short-term, but it can change a child's life and transform a whole family's life for the long term as well. I want you to learn more. I want you to get connected to all these terms. I want you to learn about the scans. I want you to nerd out. Will you please nerd out with me? Go to the website, check it all out. If you're watching any clips about this on Instagram, if you don't follow us on Instagram, at PX Docs, got to go there. It's Dr. Tony Ebel and PX Docs Network on Facebook. Go anywhere you need and ask us a question. Any comment, you put in the comments, ask a question. Send us a DM, ask a question. Whatever you need, please take this podcast, go to your favorite place, wherever you're listening to it. Please not only subscribe and download, but give us a review so we can reach other families. The sensory storm is a son of a gun. For everything we said in the beginning, not only is it a daily life struggle in all sorts of forms and fashions, but kids don't grow out of sensory issues. They grow into anxiety and ADHD and all sorts of challenges later on in life. So if you're finding this when your kiddo's sensory challenges are just in that middle, beginning, or even if they're late, there's huge change that can happen, but you can also help another family get out and through their sensory storm as well, because on the other side of this is exactly how kids are meant to be. Thriving, calm, regulated, rocking. So thank you for tuning in to another awesome episode of this Experience Miracles podcast. I went nerdy, I went deep. It was all verbal, lots of fast talking. Go to the website, check out the articles, download, subscribe, share the heck out of this. Let's save kids together. This is the place you can always count on for hope, answers, and drug-free help for your whole family. We'll see you on the next one.